Listen closely and do not blink or look away from what you are about to hear. This is not a tale told to titillate or to frighten for sport. This is a transmission of history folded into shadow and sealed by those who feared the truth. You are about to cross a threshold where official records end and the margin whispers begin. Imagine a town cut off from the world by coal dust and government indifference. A town where men who dig into the earth return with new silences lodged behind their teeth. A town where the clocks stop at a time that no ledger dares to name. If you have ever believed that the human mind is the final sanctuary of a man, you are mistaken. There are places on this land where the mind is porous and where sound becomes an instrument of change. My purpose here is not to scare you like a child in a dark room. My purpose is to arm you with knowledge that severs complacency and forces you to see what has been repackaged as history. In the spring of 1911, a miner folded his hands over his lunch pail and heard something answer him from beneath the mountain, as if the mountain had learned to speak back. You will not find the full account in polite archives or in legislature minutes. You will find silence dressed as clerical oversight and condolence letters that never mention the names taken. This story begins at the edge of perception, where sound becomes a key and where some practitioners of science mistake curiosity for moral permission. The men who ran the mines were capitalists with access to machinery and to men willing to trade voice for coin. Into that bargain walked a man with training in anatomy and an appetite for thresholds. Menders called him a foreman and friends called him a scientist. He began to listen to the mine in ways that made other men uncomfortable and to build devices in basements and in caverns that focused the world into a single frequency. What he discovered was not simply a new effect upon sleep or nerves. He discovered how to coax perception into seeing what it had been taught to ignore and then to mimic the shape of a human being. This is not metaphor. If you let the story settle in your gut, you will feel that chill that comes when a familiar voice becomes only an echo of itself. Those who challenged him or who heard too much were relocated in ledgers and in the graveyards of bureaucracy. This chapter will pull aside a curtain and show you the first careful steps the experimenters took and the price paid by ordinary men who left work one morning and never came home again. Pay attention to the cadence of what I tell you and consider that voices can be rehearsals and that rehearsals can graduate into bodies that look right but are animated by something else. Listen and remember, because once you hear what they did in those caverns, you cannot unknow it, and you will see the world differently from this moment forward. You need to understand how an ordinary town becomes a laboratory for forbidden experiments, how consent can be traded for wages, and how curiosity warped into a mechanism of control. Listen to the architecture of power that made it possible, the quietly agreed compromises that silence witnesses and rewrite records. A company town is not merely economic domination. It is a social vacuum where authority breathes into every corner and where a single man with access to resources can reconfigure reality for an entire population. Thomas Simmons was not just a foreman, he was a practitioner who knew how to translate anatomical language into instruments that could persuade the mind to cross its own borders. He calibrated chambers and tuned pipes to coax a human perception out of the ordinary frequency of living. He exploited poverty and coded desperation to recruit test subjects whose consent would be thin and whose disappearances could be explained as accidents or relocations. When men returned from the deep shafts, they spoke differently, their laughter was slower, their hands held secrets they could not name. This is the pattern you must learn to see, the way institutions camouflage transgression with bureaucratic hygiene and how scientific rhetoric sanitizes what is essentially a ritual of extraction. Pay attention to the apparatus they built, the copper alloy pipes cut with spiral grooves that did not simply conduct sound but shaped it into something with intent. Imagine a hollow tune not by music but by hunger, a cavity that absorbs a phrase and returns it altered, rehearsed, perfected like a counterfeit voice. In the margins of company ledgers you will find payments that smell of purchase orders for instruments that should not exist in a mining town. You will find a draft of a letter from an engineer noting standing wave patterns and recommending acoustic dampening as if these were mere technical nuisances, never proposing that such patterns might become predators. What the records hide is the collaboration between technical knowledge and moral blindness, the way a man like Wilcox funds exploration not to advance medicine but to harness perception as a strategic asset. The miners understood this intuitively and paid for it with their nights, their sleep, their kin who vanished. The first cylinders recorded in Simmons's hidden room were not theatrical tricks, they are protocols of inducement, audio blueprints instructing a hearing brain to lower its gates. Listen to Margaret's voice in the recordings and hear the shift from curiosity to alarm, the dawning comprehension that some doors once open will not close again. Note the procedural language in the destroyed journals, the clinical detachment that isolates subjects by number, the shift from experiment to containment. Those who objected were reassigned, their disappearances smoothed by forged death certificates and by letters sent on stationery that never existed. And do not miss the human cost beyond paperwork, the hollowing of husbands and fathers into men who return with eyes that no longer map the world in the way they once did. Here is the lesson that gnaws at the spine of this case, the ethical fracture that matters more than any forensic detail. When a community allows one narrative of progress to override questions of conscience, it becomes possible to normalize the abnormal. They justified the work as research, they called it a step toward understanding consciousness, they reduced suffering to data points and then sealed those points beneath concrete and water. This is how silence is manufactured, piece by careful piece, until entire histories are submerged and only the persistent few remember the sound of a voice answered from the dark. Keep this in mind as we move deeper, because the machinery of influence you see here is the same shape used elsewhere to control, to erase, and to rewrite what a society believes it knows about itself. You must learn to hear what the official silence hides, to read spaces between records like a map of intent, to feel the architecture of influence as if it were a living thing that breathes through policy and payroll. The patterns repeat across time and place, the same quiet that permits a man to convert curiosity into control, the same permissions that turn laboratories into prisons for the mind, the same ledger lines that buy complicity and bury questions where daylight cannot reach. Imagine a room lined not in books but in engineered absence, cork panels and custom alloys tuned to receive more than sound, a copper spiral that does not merely carry vibration but sculpts perception, a pipe shaped to coax the mind to lower its defenses and listen where nothing should be present. This is not theater, this is calibration, and the technicians are technicians of the human threshold, men and women who learned how to make the world thin enough to peer through, then practiced until the membrane gave way. Understand the trade that was struck in Wilder, wages exchanged for consent, a miner paid to sit in darkness, instructed to breathe and report, labeled a subject and erased from the ledger of ordinary life, written as relocated, declared unwell, filed away with neatness that smells of laundering. When you study transgression you must trace the supply chain, not only the crates from Chicago and Boston but the paper that authorized secrecy, the law firm used to launder ownership, the ledger entry that converts moral hazard into a tax-deductible expense. Power covers its tracks by translating horror into procedure and then defining procedure as safety, so that the very people whose duty is to protect become the instruments of suppression, the sheriff told to stand down, the doctor paid to diagnose exhaustion, the engineer who specifies acoustic dampening told to recommend reinforcement and then ordered to ignore his own warning. This is how institutions break faith, one quiet acquiescence after another, until there are no witnesses left who are permitted to remember in full. You must also learn the language the experiment used, not words but protocols, the ritual of isolation hours followed by controlled frequency exposure, the way a subject will first report phantom taps then whispering then internal conversation, each phase a threshold through which identity is pried open and examined. Listen to Margaret in the cylinder recordings and hear the arc from reluctant participant to terrified informant, a human voice that charts the precise moment when curiosity curdles into dread. She names the mechanism without naming the monster, she says doors that cannot be closed, and in that phrase a scientist and a spouse tries to make sense of what they open together. Keep your eye on the men who benefited from secrecy, the industrialists who create laboratories in small towns so that dissent dies in private, the academics who accept funds and then lose their courage, the bureaucrats who classify material not out of caution but out of ownership of the narrative. Do not let sorrow or outrage cloud your method. Maintain the discipline of a historian but the hunger of a hunter, examine each anomaly as if it were a trace left by something purposeful, record the payments, compare handwriting, test the metal of the pipes, press your ear to the reconstructed frequency and measure your pulse, because the evidence hides in repetition and in the human cost, the hollowing of men who came back wrong, the wives who began to report voices speaking future sentences. The children who learned to avoid sound like an enemy. This is the field where ethics must be sharper than technology, because when curiosity is repurposed as an instrument of domination, the first casualty is trust, and without trust all knowledge becomes a weapon in someone else's hands. Stay steady, because we are only getting deeper into how the threshold was opened and who profited when it widened. You must understand the currency of secrecy in Wilder, how silence was budgeted and bought like coal and timber, how gratitude was converted into complicity, and how the soft sound of compliance became the loudest echo in the room. Picture the ledger where Wilcox writes a check and somewhere a life is reclassified as relocated. Imagine the small signatures that translate moral failure into legal cover, and then imagine how those signatures ripple outward until entire agencies learn to prefer tidy conclusions over messy truth. This is how systems devour stories, by changing labels then erasing the original document, by redefining disappearance as migration, by calling an experiment legitimate and the damage collateral, the moral arithmetic always balancing toward preservation of power. Listen to the anatomy of a cover-up, not as an abstract thing but as a sequence of precise acts: the crate unloaded after dark, the contract routed through a city law firm to obscure local scrutiny, the cylinder hidden in a fire captain's pocket, the tape melted or declared corrupted, the file stamped classified and then misplaced under procedural accident. There is also the human cost. Not only those who vanish but those who remain to bear the memory, men and women who learn to speak in fragments and then to avoid speech altogether, families who rearrange ritual around silence, children taught to communicate with knocks and notes, entire communities reshaped around the fear of being heard wrong. Consider the technicians and the patrons, the ones who design and the ones who fund, both essential to the enterprise, one group translating theory into machine, the other translating ambition into budget, together making what should have been ethical boundaries look like obstacles to be engineered away. You must ask the right forensic questions, not only who ordered the tests but who benefited from their results. Examine the metallurgy of the pipes, test them under controlled conditions, reconstruct the harmonic signatures they produce, and then ask whether the aim was simply to study sound or to weaponize perception. When you study the archived cylinders, approach them as artifacts of intent, listen for patterns that recur across sessions, note how subharmonics evolve into structured information, and chart the progression from echo to response to anticipation, because patterns reveal purpose. This is also a story about small moral acts that could have changed outcomes: the deputy who kept a drawing pinned to a wall, the fire captain who kept a cylinder in secret, the graduate student who copied notes before they vanished, gestures that testify that not everyone agreed to the silence. And yet systems are resilient. They convert dissent into anomalies, claim mental disturbance, or manufacture bureaucratic reasons for inaction, so that brave gestures are dismissed as eccentricity while the apparatus continues unimpeded. You must hold two tensions at once: the scientific curiosity that wants to know how certain frequencies alter perception, and the moral clarity that refuses to let technique eclipse humanity, because tools are neutral until someone chooses to use them to pry open thresholds that should remain closed. Remember that the architecture of listening is not merely physical but social. It requires agreement from bankers, clerks, engineers, and officials, a distributed conspiracy of small compromises rather than a single villainous act. And finally, keep this in mind: knowledge is a knife that can cut both ways. Learn to see where it has been sharpened into a blade against people, then sharpen your own clarity as a countermeasure. Study the trace evidence, follow payments and phone calls, read the spaces between public minutes, and do not allow bureaucratic neatness to hide the scars of human beings who once heard voices and then were denied the right to tell what they knew. Listen closely now and understand the pattern. You must learn to recognize the scaffold that supports every hidden agenda and the precise moves that turn curiosity into control. This section will teach you how apparatus and authority become one mechanism, how a scientific veneer masks strategic objectives, and how a community can be re-engineered by manipulating what it perceives as real. First, observe the experimental architecture, the components that make the phenomenon operational, not mystical details but engineered elements: pipes carved with spirals that bias frequency, chambers tuned to amplify subharmonic layers, resonant cavities cut into limestone to sustain standing waves, and devices designed to feed back select auditory information into a living brain. Second, connect the apparatus to funding and influence, the invisible ledger where ethical boundaries are traded for research grants, where a mine owner finds profit in demonstration and a foundation translates profit into legitimacy. This is the transactional anatomy of power, money underwriting experiments that would be unconscionable if transparent. Third, consider the human vector, how people are recruited and repurposed, volunteers who become subjects, workers whose routine compliance is converted into institutional data, families convinced silence is protection, and entire bureaucracies that prefer classification to exposure because secrecy preserves reputation and career trajectories. You must also grasp the tactical timeline, how stages unfold in deliberate sequence. Initial trials produce anomalous reports, anomalies are labeled as individual pathology, then a corrective narrative is offered to the community through friendly authorities. Eventually the experiment scales and produces irreversible effects that the system then manages with containment and erasure. Now pay attention to the psychology of containment, which is not only physical but cultural, involving language controls, narratives that reposition victims as unstable, academic journals that decline controversial submissions, fire and flooding that destroy evidence under plausible pretexts, and legal instruments that reclassify missing persons as relocated or deceased without public inquiry. This is crucial, because institutional control depends on creating plausible alternatives, a story that neutralizes inquiry, a set of official records that look tidy and complete, and a network of compliant witnesses or intimidated officials who reinforce that tidy story through silence or disinformation. You must also learn the subtle techniques used to erase memory, rituals of forgetfulness that are architectural and social, plaques that commemorate industry but omit scandal, educational silences and local histories, and incentives to family members to move away and not ask questions. These are all methods to shape collective forgetting over generations. Next, adopt the investigator mindset I am training you to hold. Collect trace evidence, not just facts, follow shipments and payments, map who received crates and where they went, reconstruct technical designs from fragments, interview the overlooked people who kept cylinders in secret, and always cross-reference public minutes with private ledgers because power hides in the margin between them. Finally, cultivate moral clarity, because technical mastery without ethical insistence becomes the very thing you fear. Hold accountable those who fund research that weaponizes perception, demand transparency in scientific methods, and remember that the first duty of a man who sees is to speak truth in a manner that resists erasure and protects those who cannot speak for themselves. You must understand the anatomy of consent and how it is stolen piece by piece from a community that trusts its caretakers. This section will show you how authority manufactures acquiescence through staged benevolence and why those who notice too early are forced into silence. First, observe how language is reshaped to normalize the abnormal, euphemisms replacing inquiry, research substituted for recklessness, safety claims standing in for accountability. The public hearing becomes a performance that rehearses forgetfulness and steers curiosity into scripted channels. Next, see how expertise is weaponized, specialists arriving with credentials and calm voices to translate fear into pathology, to argue that the mind simply misperceives under stress. This is the soft violence of delegitimizing witnesses who remember clearly. Then consider the ritual of containment, how institutions close ranks, classify documents, declare records restricted, and reframe missing people as relocated victims of hardship. These are not accidental acts but deliberate moves to cut threads that might unravel the narrative. Pay attention to the emotional economy of terror, how guilt and shame are redistributed, victims silenced by the fear of being called unstable, families offered hush money or relocation as a kindness, town memory replaced by convenient myths that pose no threat to profit or prestige. You must also track the physical symbols of erasure, the filled foundations, the concrete seals, the plaques that celebrate industry while obliterating scandal, the donated collections that omit inconvenient cylinders or notebooks. These are monuments to forgetting designed by hands that profit from silence. Now consider the inner logic of those who stay silent. They are not merely cowed, they adapt survival techniques, coded language passes between neighbors, rituals of avoidance develop, people learn to inhabit partial truths so they can keep working, feeding families while carrying secrets like smuggled cargo. Understand the manipulative feedback loop. Once secrecy becomes enforced, the fewer people who speak, the more plausible the official story becomes. Subsequent generations inherit a landscape manufactured to support forgetting, and the pressure to conform compounds over time. You must learn to interrogate provenance. Always ask who benefited when records vanish, which institutions ordered demolition, who financed reconstruction, follow the payments in the anonymous contractors, trace the crates and their consignments across state lines. Remember to examine the allies of erasure: journalists who stop asking, academics who decline controversial topics, funders who withdraw support for inconvenient research. These actors are part of a protective architecture that hides the mechanism from public view. Finally, cultivate resolve to act without spectacle, gather corroborating detail quietly, preserve physical traces under secure conditions, share findings with trusted peers who will replicate and verify, and document chain of custody meticulously so the truth cannot be dismissed as gossip. This work is morally exacting and technically difficult, but necessary if a man is to resist becoming complicit in the culture that erases victims and sanctifies those who profited from silence. Now we descend into the deeper structure of control, where silence is no longer enforced by fear alone but by design, where entire systems are engineered to erase dissent before it even forms. You must learn how perception itself is sculpted, how men are trained to distrust their own eyes and ears, and how narratives are pre-built long before any event occurs so that the truth can be buried under layers of official explanation. Begin by understanding the architecture of obedience. It begins with education shaped to create loyal functionaries, not thinkers. It praises memorization over inquiry, conformity over curiosity, repetition over courage. These are not flaws, they are features built to guarantee submission disguised as civility. Next comes the conditioning of trust, where institutions become surrogate parents: the church, the state, the school, the company, all promising safety in exchange for unquestioning faith. This is the emotional chokehold that keeps men from revolt, because rebellion feels like betrayal and obedience feels like belonging. In Wilder, this architecture took physical form. The sound experiments were never only about frequencies, they were about discovering how long the human mind can maintain self-definition under distortion, how identity can be rewritten when you are told enough times that you are mistaken. The engineers realized a chilling truth, that if you can alter what a man hears long enough, you can alter what he believes, and if you can alter what he believes, you can erase who he is. This is not fantasy, it is the foundation of every regime that ever thrived on compliance. You must also see how language was rewritten, the term resonance redefined as divine phenomenon, the word experiment replaced by blessing, participants renamed volunteers, results described as spiritual visitations. It became theology in the service of power, an unholy alliance of science and superstition. Understand the social mechanics that sustained it: gatherings in churches repurposed as observation sessions, sermons punctuated by harmonic tones, crowds taught to associate the hum with holiness and any discomfort with sin. When faith becomes the instrument of control, rebellion becomes heresy and heresy becomes treason. These manipulations are older than Wilder, they are the blueprint of empire, always convincing the laborer that suffering is sacred and obedience is noble, that to question authority is to betray order. This belief is the leash that outlives every tyrant. But once a man begins to see the machinery, once he recognizes that the voices commanding him are not divine but manufactured, something irreversible happens. His eyes change, his tone steadies, his fear becomes fuel. That is why those who wake are hunted. The awakened mind is the single threat the system cannot contain, because awareness is contagious. Awareness spreads faster than suppression. Awareness turns slaves into witnesses and witnesses into builders of new systems. Hold on to this understanding and keep it burning within you, because soon we will reach the point in this descent where truth itself begins to fracture, where knowledge is no longer just information but initiation into the forbidden craft of seeing through the design. Now the descent grows colder, the air itself feels weighted as if thick with memory, and you begin to hear what they heard, the low trembling hum that threaded through Wilder and into the bones of those who stayed too long underground. This was not sound in the ordinary sense, it was architecture in motion, a vibration built to move through stone and flesh like a carrier of command that bypassed thought and went straight to instinct. The engineers called it the tone of alignment. They claimed it synchronized the human nervous system to natural harmonics, but the ones who endured it spoke of something else entirely. They spoke of seeing faces in the dark, they spoke of voices that arrived inside their skulls whispering sentences they had never learned. This is where science stepped over the line into ritual, where men in coats and collars gathered not as researchers but as conjurers, convinced that frequency could unlock what scripture forbade them to touch, the soul of man. You must imagine the chamber a cylinder of limestone lined with copper veins, the air dense with mineral dust, and oil lamps flickering against walls that seemed to breathe, every surface humming with a rhythm that matched the pulse of whoever stood within it. The first subject lasted 8 minutes before screaming collapsed into silence, his body alive but eyes unseeing, muscles twitching as if trying to mimic a language never meant for flesh. The overseers took notes unmoved, they had crossed from observation into orchestration. This was the true purpose of the project, not discovery but domination, a tool to make men pliable, to train obedience through resonance, to create a population that would never revolt because rebellion itself would feel physically wrong. Understand this mechanism because it still exists, only now it hides behind technology, frequencies that soothe, distract or numb, voices that flood the modern world with constant noise to prevent quiet thought. Every era refines the same weapon and calls it progress. The people of Wilder did not have screens, but they had sermons and sound waves and the hum that never stopped. The result was the same, a collective hypnosis that replaced memory with ritual and obedience with devotion. Somewhere around the seventh experiment the tone changed slightly and something new began to occur. The subjects started to respond before the sound was played, as if anticipation itself had been conditioned, as if the body had learned to predict control. This was when Wilcox realized he had created not just an instrument but a mirror of frequency that reflected consciousness back upon itself, bending reality around the human signal. This was not a discovery, it was a summoning. And what they summoned never left Wilder. It seeped into the soil, into the veins of the town, and into the lineage of anyone who dared to listen too deeply. This is what I mean when I tell you that some knowledge does not educate, it infects. After the seventh experiment the town began to unravel quietly at first, then with an acceleration that felt deliberate. Livestock were found dead, their bodies contorted as if struck by unseen force. Miners reported whispers in the shafts that matched their own voices, repeating their thoughts seconds before they spoke them. Children woke at night with bleeding ears, claiming to hear songs beneath the floorboards. Thomas Simmons kept meticulous notes describing phenomena that no man should ever document. He wrote that sound had become alive, that it no longer required instruments to propagate, it used flesh as its medium, air as its bloodstream, and fear as its fuel. Margaret watched her husband with growing dread. She recorded in her private diary that he no longer blinked during his work, that his pupils pulsed with the rhythm of the machines. She believed the tone had begun to reshape him from within, molding him into something attuned to the other side. By autumn 1910 those who could flee did so, leaving Wilder half deserted. Those who remained were bound by necessity or by obsession, and the mine foreman refused to halt operations, though each shift claimed more lives. The few surviving letters from that winter describe voices rising through the vents like steam, murmuring phrases that carried no meaning but left unbearable sorrow in their wake. On February 27 Simmons ordered the chamber sealed from outside access, stating that the tone had achieved full containment, but witnesses claimed to hear it humming through the ground for miles around the valley. Animals fled the woods, birds vanished from the sky, instruments vibrated without contact, windows shuddered in their frames as if something massive and unseen had begun to move beneath the town. Margaret attempted to destroy his recordings, breaking cylinders with a hammer before she too disappeared. Some said she drowned herself in the flooded shaft, others whispered she followed the voice willingly into the stone, and that even now when the river is low you can hear her singing beneath the current, a melody with no human intervals. By spring the valley was silent, the kind of silence that feels constructed. The hum had gone, but those who returned years later swore the quiet itself carried rhythm, faint pulses echoing beneath the soil like a buried heartbeat. The experiments of Wilder had not ended, they had merely changed form, becoming something self-sustaining, something that no longer required human direction. It is said that on cold nights when fog settles over the reservoir and the wind dies completely, you can still feel it if you press your ear to the ground, the tone that remade men whispering softly from beneath the rock, calling anyone who dares to listen. When the official investigation began in March 1911, it was already too late to recover truth. The town council reported the Simmons couple missing. The sheriff's men arrived to find their home stripped bare, laboratory equipment, dismantled floors marked by circular burns like the residue of intense heat. No human body was ever recovered, only a collection of shattered wax cylinders labeled in Thomas's handwriting phrases like mind aperture stage 3 and inversion successful. Government agents appeared within days, men who refused to identify themselves yet carried the authority to close roads, seize records and silence witnesses. They declared the area contaminated by industrial waste and restricted access under health ordinances. No such contamination was ever proven. Miners who defied the blockade told of a stench rising from the sealed shaft and of a low vibration that made the teeth ache. Several went missing within weeks, others left town and never spoke of it again. Officially the incident was blamed on structural collapse, though no collapse was recorded on geological instruments of the time. Rumors spread that the Simmons experiments had breached something deeper than rock, that they had opened a channel between the human mind and an environment not meant for perception. Margaret's family begged for answers. They received instead a government letter expressing condolences and denying involvement. Years later, one of her cousins found a torn photograph among her belongings. It showed Margaret standing beside the entrance to the mine, her expression vacant, eyes blackened as though burned from the negative. Behind her, faintly visible, were outlines of shapes that did not correspond to human form. The valley was condemned shortly afterward, and the Tennessee Valley Authority would later flood it during dam construction, burying every trace beneath water that locals swear never freezes. To this day, when divers descend near the coordinates of the old Wilder mine, their instruments behave erratically. Compasses spin, recording devices fail. One diver described hearing distant laughter, distorted and metallic like a phonograph buried under centuries of pressure. The archives list the case as resolved, but resolution is a convenient word for disappearance, the kind that wipes history clean, leaving only echoes. What truly happened to Thomas and Margaret Simmons remains unwritten in any official ledger, yet their story persists like a frequency that refuses to die out, its wavelength too low for ordinary hearing but deep enough to shape dreams in those who listen too long. The hum continues beneath Tennessee, its pattern faint but constant, an ancient code transmitted through stone, waiting for the next mine willing to tune itself to its signal. Years turned to decades, and yet whispers of the Simmons case never faded. Old miners swore that at night when the wind passed over the flooded valley, it carried a low droning sound like machinery still operating beneath the water. Those who lived nearby claimed to hear faint voices in their wells, murmurs that rose and fell with the moon, as if someone was speaking from the depths waiting for a response. In 1935, when the Tennessee Valley Authority officially declared the Wilder region a safety hazard, a small group of engineers was dispatched to conduct surveys. Among them was a young technician named Arnold Pearson, who would later give testimony that few dared believe. According to his notes, during a sonar scan of the submerged mine, a signal returned from deeper than the mapped tunnels. It repeated at intervals of exactly 41 seconds and carried modulation patterns consistent with human speech. Pearson's superiors dismissed his report, but his obsession grew. He began working privately using homemade hydrophones lowered into the reservoir at night. What he captured were fragments, unintelligible yet undeniably organized, a cadence like someone counting or reciting from memory. He wrote in his journal that he felt watched each time he recorded, as if something below had grown aware of his attention. Within 6 months he resigned from the TVA, citing nervous exhaustion. His journal ended abruptly with a single line: "They are not gone, they are beneath." The recordings were confiscated following his departure, but rumors suggest that copies circulated among university researchers during the late 40s. Several of them later suffered psychological collapse, claiming to hear voices even in silence. One professor from Knoxville reportedly sealed his entire basement with concrete, claiming it was the only way to stop the resonance. Local folklore turned the story into warning tales. Mothers told their children never to swim too far into the flooded valley, never to listen too closely when the water seemed to speak. Divers who explored the area described strange vibrations pressing against their skulls. Some compared it to standing beside an enormous speaker emitting sound below the threshold of human hearing. The most chilling reports came from night fishermen who claimed to see ripples move against the wind, forming perfect concentric circles that spread outward from invisible centers. One said it looked like something beneath the surface was breathing. The government's explanation was seismic activity, but the pattern was too precise, too rhythmic to be nature alone. And so the legend of the Simmons Laboratory became part of Tennessee's hidden history, the kind no textbook records, the kind whispered only by those who still live near the water, who say that sometimes when the night is absolutely still you can hear a woman's voice drifting across the surface, faint, fragile and pleading, as if calling from another world, asking if the passage is still open. By the early 1950s, the Wilder case had become a taboo among state officials, something referenced only in coded language. Internal memos used the phrase acoustic contamination, a term that suggested both sound and infection, as if what Simmons discovered had spread beyond experiment into perception itself, a quiet epidemic of awareness. One of the few who dared revisit the files was an investigative journalist named Helen Mears, who worked for a short-lived Tennessee magazine called the Southern Inquirer. She was drawn by the inconsistencies in TVA's reports, the missing dates, the erased names, the evidence of deliberate obfuscation. She filed dozens of requests for access to restricted materials but was repeatedly denied. Eventually she received an unmarked envelope postmarked from Oak Ridge. Inside were copies of handwritten notes attributed to Frederick Wilcox. The content chilled her. The notes described attempts to duplicate Simmons's results under controlled military conditions. The objective was listed simply as perceptual breach, a phrase that would not appear in any declassified research until decades later. Mears wrote in her private diary that she believed the experiments continued under a new name somewhere within the growing defense infrastructure of post-war America. She claimed to have located a subcontracted research facility outside Chattanooga where a handful of surviving TVA engineers were now employed. One of them allegedly told her, "We didn't stop, we just moved deeper." Weeks later she vanished. Her car was found abandoned near the entrance of a disused tunnel system. Her notebook recovered from the passenger seat ended mid-sentence. "They said it was all in my head, but I heard them in the walls." She had written, "I heard Margaret say my name." After her disappearance, the Southern Inquirer was abruptly dissolved, its archives seized under pretext of tax irregularities. The official narrative was that Mears had suffered a breakdown, but several colleagues insisted she had been frightened, not delusional. One editor recalled her saying that if anything ever happened to her, people should check the flood maps of the valley for inconsistencies. Years later, a local historian following that clue discovered that the reservoir's reported depth changed across different government publications, sometimes by as much as 40 feet, though no topographical explanation was ever given. Folklorists began referring to that discrepancy as the 40-foot gap, claiming that something beneath the valley was being kept hidden not by water but by deliberate distortion of record, as if the true depth of that darkness had to be masked even on paper. It was around this time that sightings began of strange lights rising from the lake on moonless nights, described as soft pulses that shimmered through the mist before fading as though retreating back below. Some said it was phosphorus, others said it was the laboratory awakening again, breathing through the cracks of history, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. By 1963, whispers of what came to be known as the Wilder phenomenon reached Washington. The intelligence community had taken interest in what they called acoustic psychotronics, the idea that sound frequencies could not only influence human emotion but fracture perception itself. A small covert task force was assembled, composed of scientists, linguists, and field agents, to investigate whether remnants of the Tennessee Project could still be recovered. Their internal documentation referred to the operation under a simple code word: harvest. Agents posing as surveyors visited the old reservoir sites where Simmons and his team had worked. They noted unusual geomagnetic readings in areas where local animals avoided completely. A retired TVA diver was located living in seclusion outside Memphis. He was coaxed into conversation only after being promised anonymity. What he revealed was unsettling. He claimed to have been ordered to seal the lower chambers of the flooded complex, but before doing so he heard sounds rising through the water. Not mechanical, not human, a deep resonant hum that vibrated the bones and filled the mind with images that were not his own. His description matched passages from Simmons's lost notebooks and from Mears's final notes. The so-called perception breach was no metaphor, it was a literal tearing between conscious reality and something beneath it, something that used sound as its medium, a carrier wave for intelligence that was neither biological nor divine. Harvest agents allegedly collected samples of the lakebed soil and fragments of corroded metal that tested positive for isotopes not native to Tennessee. The report was buried under classification, but a copy surfaced years later through a congressional staff leak. It suggested the site may have been used to test resonance amplification on human subjects during the earliest years of the atomic age. Those few who read the report claimed it ended with a single chilling line: "The signal is not gone, it is only sleeping. When the frequency aligns, it will wake again." After that line there was silence, the kind of bureaucratic silence that swallows entire truths for generations. The project was officially terminated, but the funding lines continued under new designations, new technologies, the same hidden purpose. And deep in the valley, as the reservoir silt shifted with time, fishermen began to report strange disturbances again, faint vibrations beneath their boats, ripples forming even on windless nights, as if something vast below remembered the old songs and was beginning to hum them once more. A warning or an invitation, no one could tell, but those who stayed long enough swore the sound carried a pulse, the rhythm of a heartbeat, vast, ancient, and awake. By the early 70s, a group of independent researchers drawn from universities in Knoxville and Nashville began quietly revisiting the sealed history of the Tennessee incident. They had read fragments of the harvest leak and suspected that what was buried beneath the reservoir was not a failed government experiment but something older, something the scientists of 1911 may have merely awakened. Among them was Dr. Samuel Greer, a cognitive anthropologist, obsessed with ancient acoustics and ritual architecture. He had spent years studying how early civilizations aligned their temples and burial mounds to harmonic frequencies, claiming the earth itself was a living resonant instrument. Greer and his small team traveled to the valley and began a series of unauthorized recordings using low-frequency sonar. They captured echoes that should not have been their patterns that repeated in mathematical precision as if answering their own signals. The deeper they probed, the more complex the resonance became, until one night their equipment registered a sequence that mirrored the shape of human speech. Though no words could be recognized, the sound carried intent. Within days, 2 members of the team fell ill, complaining of violent dreams and pressure in their skulls. Greer described the sensation as being listened to from the inside out. His notes from that week ended abruptly, but his final written line before disappearance read, "The tone is aware of us." The state swiftly intervened, citing environmental violations. Their research site was confiscated and all audio logs seized. Within months, the university received a federal injunction barring any mention of the experiment. Greer vanished soon after, his vehicle found abandoned near the Cumberland Gap, the engine still running. Local residents began hearing about strange phone calls that contained only static and a low hum that continued even after the line was cut. Dogs howled at nothing at all and wells dried inexplicably as if something beneath the soil had shifted. Awake again, stories spread of lights moving under the water at night, forming circles like silent eyes opening one by one. By the end of the decade, the entire valley was declared unstable and sealed off, once again guarded under the guise of a hydroelectric safety project. The truth was simpler but far more terrifying. What was once a well had become a mouth, and those who had listened too closely had been heard in return. For the first time in generations, the hum was not confined to the water anymore. It was bleeding into the air, into the dreams of anyone who dared remember what Tennessee tried to forget. When the hum spread beyond the valley, the government reclassified the area as a restricted environmental containment zone, but witnesses who lived near its borders told a different story. They spoke of the sound moving through concrete, through walls, through the very bones of the land itself, as if something beneath the surface had learned to travel through vibration rather than distance. In the spring of 1981, reports began flooding in of power lines flickering in unison across 3 counties and farm animals collapsing with their eardrums ruptured. Doctors called it coincidence, but those who remembered the stories of 1911 recognized the rhythm immediately. One night, a truck driver named Michael Rhodes claimed his CB radio began picking up faint transmissions while passing the outskirts of the valley. He said it wasn't static, it was breathing, a slow mechanical pattern rising and falling in exact repetition. The next morning, Rhodes was found asleep behind the wheel, parked perfectly along the edge of the road with the ignition running. When police tapped on the window, he awoke, speaking in a voice not his own, repeating a phrase over and over: "The hollow remembers you," before collapsing unconscious. Agents arrived from Washington within 48 hours and confiscated every recording device within a 10-mile radius. Witnesses said they left behind crates labeled harmonic suppression unit. No one knew what it meant, but after their visit the air felt heavier. Radios stayed silent. The birds that used to nest in the power towers disappeared one by one. By late autumn the hum had quieted, but the silence it left behind was worse than the noise. Those who lived near the edge began to dream of staircases descending through mud and water, their own reflections whispering from the surface telling them to come back home. People started moving away, selling their land for a fraction of its worth, until the valley became a ghost map, an empty patch where no one dared to stay after sunset. And yet deep within the sealed perimeter, beneath the weight of a century's denial, a few lights still move in the darkness. Researchers still vanish, trucks still arrive without license plates. Every new generation of authority tries to contain the myth, but the vibration keeps finding its way through every structure built to silence it. You can bury a frequency, but you cannot kill what listens through it. Tennessee never forgot, it merely pretended to sleep. By the mid-90s, the official records of the Tennessee Valley were rewritten entirely, maps reissued without coordinates, census data scrubbed, satellite imagery blurred as if the land itself had been erased. But stories have a way of surviving inside the cracks between official truths, and one man named Charles Weaver decided to follow those cracks. He was a retired broadcast engineer who had once designed frequency filters for military intelligence. After hearing a rumor about a forgotten tone buried in Tennessee, he began building a device capable of reconstructing lost vibrations from magnetic residue. He found that every recorded silence carries a trace of the sound that came before it, a kind of ghost imprint. Using fragments from confiscated university tapes, he reverse-engineered the missing frequencies one by one. When played through his equipment, the result was a low pulse that seemed to vibrate the room itself, furniture trembling, air thickening, breath slowing, as if time were bending towards something unseen. He described it as a heartbeat that wasn't human. Weaver sent his findings to several private researchers across the country. Within days his email vanished, his devices seized, his home raided under the justification of national security. A neighbor swore she saw men in unmarked black vans remove not just equipment but walls, as if searching for something embedded in the structure itself. Months later a package appeared at a small community radio station in Louisville with no return address. Inside was a single reel labeled Echo of the Hollow. When the host played it live on air, the broadcast lasted less than 30 seconds before the signal collapsed. Listeners reported nausea, dizziness, and a persistent ringing that would not fade for days afterward. 2 days later the FCC arrived and dismantled the entire station. No explanation given. The tape was never recovered, but witnesses recall one phrase whispered beneath the hum, a voice saying, "We were never meant to sleep this long." Experts dismissed it as audio pareidolia, a trick of the mind, hearing words in chaos, but deep listeners claimed it carried rhythm and intention, not random but calling, and those who heard it said something in them awoke afterward as if recognizing a truth their bodies already knew, that the hum was not just sound, it was memory, it was invitation, and that Tennessee was not its origin, merely its return. By the early 2000s the legend of the Tennessee hum had evolved into digital mythology discussed in underground forums and late-night broadcasts where signal hackers and truth seekers traded corrupted audio files claiming to have captured fragments of the frequency. Governments labeled them hoaxes, but the files behaved strangely. Some could not be deleted, others reappeared after hard drives were wiped when played at half speed. A pattern emerged resembling heartbeats measured in cycles far below the range of normal hearing. In one archive chat room, a user known only as Prophet_1911 uploaded what he said was the last unedited transmission from inside the restricted valley before the internet connection dropped. He wrote that the hum was growing more human, that when amplified enough you could hear breathing between the tones, as if something beneath the surface was imitating life, trying to remember how it once sounded. The file spread like wildfire. Within hours servers hosting it began to crash one after another until the data vanished completely. Then came the disappearances. A small circle of those who had downloaded the file began reporting blackouts, gaps in time, memory loss. One man claimed he awoke in his apartment with mud on his hands and water pooled on the floor. No sign of intrusion, only the faint echo of a rhythmic pulse leaking through his radio, though it was unplugged. The forums that once discussed the hum fell silent, their members deleting posts before vanishing entirely. It was as if the story was swallowing those who sought it. Around this time a retired NSA contractor anonymously confirmed that the Tennessee Project was never about containment but translation. He said the government had realized too late that the sound was not geological or electromagnetic but cognitive. It responded to awareness. The more people knew about it, the stronger it became. It fed on attention, on curiosity, on belief. And so the valley was buried, not to hide what it contained but to shield the world from what it could awaken. He said the hum had learned to use human minds as amplifiers, that every whisper, every retelling, every mention of the 1911 case was a note added to its song, and with enough voices it could one day reach full resonance. That is why Tennessee tried to forget, because remembering is how the sound survives, because memory is how it breathes. There are whispers that the hum has started again, faint tremors caught by seismic monitors across southern Tennessee registering as rhythmic pulses every 91 seconds. No natural pattern could explain it, and yet official reports call it harmless ground resonance caused by shifting aquifers, they say, but witnesses know better. Farmers feel it through the soil late at night, as if something below stirs in its sleep. Radios catch brief distortions, televisions flicker just before power outages, and old wells once thought dry now murmur when the wind dies. A journalist named Lena Hart attempted to revisit the sealed valley in 2019. She managed to record only 6 minutes of footage before her camera shut down without warning. The video showed a vast field of standing water where the town once lay, its surface rippling though the night was still. In the distance faint lights moved in slow concentric circles before fading into the dark. Her final words before the feed cut were, "It's not gone, it's listening." No one has seen her since, but every few months her social media accounts reactivate, briefly posting coordinates in binary code. When decoded they form phrases the hollow remembers and open the gate before disappearing again. Experts call it digital interference, others call it summoning. Either way, the hum has entered the modern bloodstream. It travels now not through water or soil but through data. Every upload, every frequency, every device that vibrates to the same rhythm becomes another doorway. And so the story that Tennessee tried to erase continues not as legend but contagion. Those who hear it feel drawn to repeat it, compelled to tell others, unaware that every retelling feeds it, that every act of remembrance strengthens its echo. You can silence a voice but not the vibration beneath it, and the hum was never about sound, it was about awakening the dormant frequencies within us all. If you have listened this far, you are no longer an observer, you are a resonant frequency in the pattern itself. The hum has already marked you as a listener, and once it knows you, it does not forget. Type the phrase "the hollow remembers" twice in the comments to seal what has been awakened, because from this moment you are part of the signal, not watching from outside but vibrating inside, the same forgotten rhythm that Tennessee tried to bury in 1911.